Thieves like you don't shop here. You prowl. Officer Dale Rohr's voice cut through the mall like a blade, sharp and deliberate, designed to carry. He wrenched Lorraine Whitaker's arms behind her back and cinched the cuffs until the metal bit into her skin. Not tight enough to be called a mistake, but tight enough to send a message. Caught you slipping, didn't we? He drove her shoulder into the boutique window. Glass shuddered under the impact. A ring of shoppers stalled mid-stride, bags hanging frozen at their sides. Phones rose, one by one, like sunflowers turning towards something they couldn't look away from. Trent Voss nudged her fallen receipt with the toe of his boot, that small ivory slip that proved everything, and sent it skidding across the tile like it was trash. What did you think? Nobody checks bags around here. His grin widened into something ugly. You people always figure the rules don't apply. Lorraine's clothes were plain, unremarkable. A simple blouse, dark slacks, low heels. Exactly what they had already decided a thief looked like. She didn't flinch. She didn't plead. She didn't beg or cry or raise her voice. While her shoulders screamed from the impact and the cuffs cut into her wrists, her mind did what it had been trained to do across 23 years on the federal bench. It cataloged. Badge number on Rohr's chest, 4723. Badge number on Voss, 4891. The time on the mall clock above the directory, 12:07 p.m. 6 security cameras visible from her current position. Two more partially obscured by decorative columns. The faces in the crowd. The angle of the nearest phone recording. The exact words spoken. The exact order they were spoken in. The two officers parading her through Briarwood Mall in handcuffs had absolutely no idea who they had just arrested. The woman in plain clothes they had decided was a thief was a federal judge assigned to oversee every courtroom, every case, and every officer in their entire county. They had just made the worst mistake of their careers, and she was already building the case to prove it. The afternoon had begun the way many of Lorraine Whitaker's afternoons began. Quietly, purposefully, and entirely on her own terms. The sun streamed through Briarwood Mall's skylights, casting warm rectangular patches across the polished floor that shoppers stepped through without noticing. The way people passed through beauty without registering it. Lorraine walked at an unhurried pace. Her low heels clicked a steady rhythm against the tiles. The small boutique bag in her hand swayed gently with each step. She had just treated herself to a silk scarf, deep burgundy with fine gold threading, a small, private reward for closing a corruption case that had taken 14 months of meticulous preparation. The defendant, a county contractor who had overbilled federal infrastructure projects by nearly $4 million, had been convicted on all 12 counts. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours. She was thinking about dinner, maybe the Italian place near the courthouse, maybe just soup at home and an early night. The case had been exhausting the way only long, detail-heavy work could be, a slow, grinding drain that she hadn't fully felt until the moment the gavel came down. That was when her body knew something her eyes hadn't confirmed yet. The shadow dance began subtly, a shift in footstep patterns behind her. 2 sets of boots, heavy-soled, authoritative, maintaining an unnatural synchrony with her pace. When she slowed slightly to look at a window display, they slowed. When she turned left at the corridor junction, they turned left. She didn't react visibly. She had learned long ago that reaction is information, and information, in the wrong hands, is a weapon. Instead, she used her reflections. Every polished storefront window in Briarwood Mall became a mirror. In one after another, she confirmed what her instincts had already told her. 2 uniformed officers, both male, both white, one older, mid-40s, stocky through the shoulders, hand resting on his belt with the casual authority of a man who had done this many times. The other younger, leaner, moving with a barely contained eagerness that made her think of dogs straining at leashes, anticipating the moment of release. She recognized the operation immediately. She had seen it described in dozens of depositions, civil rights complaints, and internal affairs reports across her years on the bench. Target, follow, wait for the right moment, create the confrontation in the most public space possible. Make it loud, make it visible, make the subject feel exposed and powerless in front of as many witnesses as possible, so that even if they fight back, they're already bleeding credibility. It was a performance. and they had chosen their stage with precision. As she passed a boutique where she had purchased a scarf, Lorraine noticed a third player. Janice Clean, Briarwood's head of security, stood in the boutique doorway wearing a perfectly pressed blazer and an expression of severe, practiced calm. The kind of calm that isn't natural. The kind that's rehearsed. Clean pressed a manicured finger to her earpiece, lips moving in whispered commands. Her eyes tracked Lorraine with the fixed attention of a chess player, watching a piece move across the board exactly as predicted. Lorraine took 3 more steps. Officer Rohr made his move. He cut directly through the flow of shoppers, positioning himself in her path with the practiced ease of someone who had run this play before. His smile arrived first, wide, friendly-seeming, completely disconnected from his eyes, which were cold and certain. "Ma'am, you're coming with us for theft." He pitched his voice to Carrie. Deliberately loud, deliberately public, heads turned in a radius of 30 feet. A teenager lowered a soft pretzel halfway to his mouth and forgot to raise it again. A mother gathered her small child against her hip and stepped back. An elderly couple froze near a bench. Before Lorraine could respond, before she could speak a single word, Officer Voss came from behind. His fingers found her arm with practiced precision, dug in hard, and wrenched it backward and upward in a motion that sent a white-hot line of pain from her shoulder down through her elbow. The force was not accidental. It was not necessary. It was a statement. Her boutique bag slipped from her fingers and landed with a soft thud on the tile. The burgundy scarf inside, her small, private celebration, lay crumpled in its tissue paper. "I'd like to speak with the store manager," Lorraine said. Her voice was completely steady. 23 years on the bench teaches you to keep your voice steady when your body is screaming, and I'd like to see proof of this alleged theft. The crowd around them thickened. The glow of phone screens created a constellation at waist height as people raised their devices. Lorraine registered each one. Each recording device was a potential piece of evidence. Each face in the crowd was a potential witness. She was already filing, already organizing, already beginning the architecture of what would come next, even as the metal cuffs bit deeper into her wrists. Janice Clean stepped forward with the theatrical timing of a stage manager making an entrance. Her heels struck the floor in crisp, deliberate beats. The item was concealed. She announced to no one and everyone simultaneously, her voice carrying the manufactured certainty of someone delivering rehearsed lines. She did not specify which item. She did not point to evidence. She did not produce a receipt discrepancy or an inventory report or any documentation whatsoever. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for shoplifting. I have my receipt," Lorraine began, but Rohr was already moving. "You can tell it to the judge," he sneered, and the contempt in his voice had a particular quality. The comfortable contempt of a man who had never once imagined that the person he was speaking to might actually be that judge. The handcuffs came out. The metal caught the light from the skylights above as he snapped them around her wrists, cinching them with practiced tightness. Not tight enough to be visibly abusive in a crowd, but tight enough that after 10 minutes, her hands would begin to go numb. She knew the calibration. She had read it in medical reports attached to dozens of excessive force complaints. She refused to wince. Her mind kept moving. The exact time, 12:07 p.m. The growing number of witnesses. At least 23 visible from her current position. The security cameras. She had now counted 9 with confirmed lines of sight to this location. The way Voss's grip had left visible marks on her forearm, where his fingers had dug in. The slight tremor in the hand of a young female store clerk watching from the boutique doorway. A clerk who clearly had not expected this. Clearly had not been briefed on what loss prevention exercise was supposed to look like when it arrived. That tremor was information too. "Start walking," Rohr commanded and shoved her forward. The force of it nearly put her on the floor. She caught herself, one stumbling half-step, then she found her balance and kept moving. She would not fall. She would not give them that. If they wanted theater, they would have to produce it without her cooperation. They marched her down the main corridor of the mall, past a family with 3 children and shopping bags from 4 different stores, past a group of teenagers, every single one of them raising a phone, past a shoe store, a coffee kiosk, a jewelry display. The officers positioned themselves precisely, one on each side, close enough that her handcuffed wrists were visible to every person they passed, far enough apart that she could not create any visual privacy for herself. It was staging. Every element of it. The pace, slow enough to extend exposure. The formation, designed to maximize visibility. The corridor, the busiest artery in the mall, connecting the food court to the anchor stores. This was not an arrest. This was a message. And the message was not meant for her. It was meant for everyone watching. A woman with a stroller pulled her child close and whispered something to her companion. An elderly man in a plaid jacket shook his head slowly, the way people do when they see something wrong and don't know what to do about it. More phones appeared. Lorraine held her head high, not in defiance, in documentation. She needed a clear face visible in as many recordings as possible. She needed the crowd to see someone who was not afraid, not guilty, not broken. She needed every phone recording what her posture communicated. This is not a criminal. This is something else entirely. Her wrists throbbed. The cuffs had tightened further with the movement. Or perhaps Roar had adjusted them during the walk. She cataloged the increasing pain with clinical precision. Deep tissue pressure. Potential bruising to the radial nerve pathway. Possible circulation restriction to the left hand, which had gone slightly numb in the last 2 minutes. Onset of shoulder joint pain consistent with the force extension Voss had applied during the initial grab. She noted the time again from the digital directory as they passed. 12:11 p.m. Keep moving, Voss growled, close to her ear, when she slowed slightly to reduce the pressure on her wrists. His voice carried just enough threat, low, private, not for crowd, to signal what came after warnings. Nearby shoppers dropped their eyes and found reasons to look at their feet, their phones, anything but what was happening 3 feet away from them. At his small electronics kiosk near the East Corridor junction, Milo Garner had stopped arranging a display of phone cases. He stood very still, watching. He was perhaps 25 slight, with dark, careful eyes that absorbed everything happening in front of him. Above his kiosk, mounted at a 45-degree angle to the corridor, a security camera blinked its small red eye with steady patience. It had seen everything. It was still seeing everything. Lorraine filed his face and his kiosk position away. "I'd like to speak with a supervisor," she said again, keeping her voice level and audible, ensuring that phrase appeared on as many recordings as possible. "And I need to contact my attorney." Voss answered by yanking her arm sharply upward, a sudden, vicious motion that sent a bolt of pain from her shoulder into her neck. "Stop resisting," he barked, loud for the crowd. She had not moved. She had not pulled or twisted or shifted her weight. She had simply walked and spoken. The accusation of resistance was not a description of what was happening. It was the beginning of a narrative designed to create legal cover for what had already happened. She's not resisting. The voice came from within the crowd, clear, steady, carrying its own kind of authority. Denise Harper stepped forward. She was perhaps 40, neatly dressed in a blazer and sensible heels, the kind of shoes worn by someone who spends long hours on their feet in a professional environment. Her phone was raised and recording. Her hand was not shaking. What exactly did she do? We have a right to know. Roar's head snapped toward her. The friendly mask dropped for just a fraction of a second, long enough to show what was underneath. "Back up, ma'am, unless you want to be charged with obstruction of justice." His free hand moved his belt, fingers finding the familiar position near his radio. "I'm asking a question," Denise said. She stepped back, one small step, the minimum concession to the physical reality of the threat, but her phone stayed up and her lens stayed on. "That's not obstruction. The store has reported missing inventory." Clean emerged from behind a decorative column, appearing exactly where and when she was needed, moving like someone following choreography she had run many times before. Her voice was smooth, certain, and completely devoid of specifics. She adjusted her blazer. One small, quick movement, a nervous tell she probably didn't know she was making. "We take theft very seriously at Briarwood Mall." Lorraine's mind flagged the statement immediately. Missing inventory. Not a specific item. Not a specific value. Not a specific description. In 23 years of federal law, she had learned that vague accusations from officials were almost always the most revealing kind. Specificity requires truth. Vagueness gives room to maneuver, room to adjust a story if the evidence doesn't cooperate. No item had been named. No evidence had been shown. No store employee had approached. No receipt had been examined. No bag had been searched. Lorraine had a receipt in her purse, time-stamped, itemized, digitally signed by the boutique's payment processor, and not one person had asked to see it. She filed that away. She filed all of it away. At the corner where the east corridor turned toward the service areas, Voss steered her sideways without warning and slammed her shoulder hard into the wall. The impact sent fresh pain radiating down her arm in a wave that made her vision blur for half a second. Need to reposition, he muttered, as if the wall had been in the way and not deliberately targeted. But his smirk, that small, satisfied curl at the corner of his mouth, told the real story. Through the glass storefront of a temporarily closed clothing shop, Lorraine caught something that made her pulse quicken with a very specific recognition. The reflection showed Milo's kiosk camera from this angle. Its red light blinked steadily. The angle of the glass had created a perfect mirror of the corner where they now stood. Everything that had just happened, the wall impact, the smirk, the body position, was visible in that reflection, caught by a camera the officers had not thought to disable, in a reflection they had not thought to check for. She committed the exact geometry to memory, the kiosk position, the storefront angle. The camera's field of view is visible in the reflection. She would need to be able to describe that geometry precisely, in exact feet and degrees, under oath. Another piece, another brick. More phones had appeared in the crowd now. A teenager in a gray hoodie said quietly to his friend, "This isn't right." An elderly woman clutched her shopping bags against her chest, as a proximity to injustice might contaminate them. The air had thickened. That particular atmospheric pressure that gathers in places where people are witnessing something wrong and haven't yet decided what to do about it. "Those cuffs are too tight," Denise called from the edge of the crowd, her voice shaking now, but holding its ground. "She's not fighting you. There's absolutely no need for this." "Final warning," Rohr said flatly. "Clear the area or face arrest." He wasn't looking at Denise. He was looking at Lorraine, assessing, calculating. Lorraine drew a measured breath. She had been assessing and calculating too. From the first moment she felt those footsteps behind her, she had the badge numbers. She had the timestamps. She had the crowd, the phones, the cameras. She had Milo's kiosk and its unobserved angle. She had the store clerk's trembling hand and Clean's nervous blazer adjustment and Voss's smirk against the wall. She had enough. And now it was time to change the geometry of the situation entirely. When she spoke, her voice carried something that had nothing to do with volume. It was the weight of 2 decades on the federal bench, the authority of 10,000 hearings, the absolute, immovable certainty of someone who has spent her career as a final word in a room. "I am Judge Lorraine Whitaker, Federal Court, Eastern District." The effect moved through both officers simultaneously, like a current passing through a wire. Rohr and Voss froze mid-step. Their grips loosened. Involuntary. Automatic. The body reacting before the brain had finished processing. Voss's face drained of color with a speed that was almost clinical. The crowd's murmuring didn't grow louder so much as it shifted in register, from the whispered concern of bystanders watching something wrong to the electric, wide-eyed awareness of people watching something historic. More phones rose. Several people stepped closer, rather than back. Rohr recovered first. He was better at the mask than Voss. The friendly professional expression snapped back into place within 2 seconds, but now there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Something cold and calculating and slightly desperate. He leaned in close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her ear. "Not here," he whispered. 2 words, barely audible, but the thread in them was perfectly legible to someone who had spent a career parsing the language of people under pressure. "Not here. Not because I'm backing down. Not here because there are too many cameras, too many phones, too many witnesses. Not here because we need to change the location before we figure out what to do about this." Lorraine filed even that away. Milo stood rigid at his kiosk counter, both hands gripping the edge. His knuckles had gone white. Denise's phone had not wavered once, the lens steady, capturing everything, the live stream running to wherever it was running. Clean's perfect corporate composure had developed its first visible crack, a small, rapid twitch at the corner of her mouth that came and went like a fault line registering pressure. Lorraine kept her chin level. She had spent years reading the language of guilt and fear from the elevated perspective of the bench. The micro-expressions, the body shifts, the tells that people never know they're giving. She read them all now. The quick glance roared through at Voss. Reassess, pivot, new plan. The way Clean's fingers found and twisted a button on her blazer. The physical expression, a narrative coming apart. The slight tremor in Voss's jaw that came when he was afraid of something he wasn't willing to admit. The handcuffs continued their work on her wrists. She let the pain sharpen her focus rather than scatter it. The security office door closed behind them with the soft, definitive click of a space designed to feel inescapable. Janice Clean's manicured hand stayed on the handle a half-second longer than necessary. The gesture of someone who needed to confirm the lock had caught. The room had been designed with careful, considered spareness. 2 chairs, a metal desk bolted to the floor, a security camera in the high corner of the room, but mounted at an angle that pointed toward the wall rather than the area where a detained person would be seated. The placement was not accidental. Nothing in this room was accidental. Lorraine read the space with the same attention she gave courtrooms. The distance from the door to the chairs, the angle of the camera, the position of the desk relative to the only exit, the deliberate absence of anything that might allow someone detained here to feel that they had any leverage whatsoever. It was architecture as psychology, design as control. Sit, Rohr said. The professional courtesy had gone. What remained was command, flat and unambiguous. When Lorraine remained standing, he stepped into her personal space. Your continued noncompliance constitutes assault on an officer. Voss pulled out a notepad and uncapped his pen with the exaggerated focus of a student demonstrating effort. His hand moved across the page in the performance of documentation, but his eyes never moved to observe what he claimed to be recording. The scratch of the pen was texture, not content. Theater within theater. I request immediate access to your body cam footage, Lorraine said. Her voice remained steady despite the pain radiating from her shoulder, which had begun to develop a deep bone-level ache from the combined impacts of Voss's initial grab and the wall. Both officers' cameras, all mall security footage, and any surveillance covering the store and corridors. Rohr patted his chest with one hand, a slow, deliberate gesture, in the spot where the camera should have been mounted. His smile arrived without reaching his eyes. Technical glitch today. Real shame. The timing of that malfunction. The simultaneous failure of both cameras. Lorraine noted it and moved on. Our security protocols are very clear, Clean said, positioning herself smoothly between Lorraine and the desk where her phone had been placed. Her tone was corporate, practiced, pleasant, the voice of someone who had spent years presenting company policy as natural law. No outside communication during an active investigation. I need the following documented formally, Lorraine said. Both officers' names and badge numbers. An incident report number. And immediate medical attention for my shoulder, which sustained injury during the arrest. Medical attention isn't necessary at this time, Clean replied. She began circling slowly behind Lorraine, heels clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. The sound of authority moving through its own space. I am officially requesting it, Lorraine said. Please note the time and date of this denial in whatever documentation you are producing. Voss's pen stopped moving. His knuckles whitened around it. Now, Clean said, and the theatrical surprise in her voice was almost admirable in its precision. What's this? She bent near Lorraine's purse, which had been placed on the floor beside the desk, with an expression of just-discovered concern. Officer Rohr, please observe. From the pocket of her blazer, latex gloves appeared. Too quickly, far too quickly, already on her hands before the line had finished leaving her mouth. She lifted a small plastic bag from beside the purse, held it up between 2 fingers, displaying it to the room the way a magician displays the card they produce from nowhere. Illegal substances, in addition to theft. This is a very serious situation. Lorraine did not flinch. Her eyes moved with deliberate slowness across every element of this performance. The position of the bag relative to the purse, the exact distance from the purse's left side to where the bag had supposedly been found, the fact that Clean's gloves had been in her blazer pocket, already on, already ready, before she had reached down, the timing of the discovery, which had occurred at almost exactly the moment the conversation had shifted in a direction they hadn't anticipated. The bag itself, which was not something she had ever possessed, purchased, or touched. That evidence is planted, Lorraine said. Her voice was as calm as a reading of a statute. I want federal counsel immediately, and I demand preservation of all security footage from this room and every surrounding area for the past 4 hours. Making accusations against officers. Rohr clicked his tongue, a disappointed, theatrical sound. That's not going to help your situation. He moved to stand directly in front of her, using the full geometry of his height and build to establish physical dominance. Maybe you're not fully understanding how much trouble you're in right now. I understand exactly what is happening, Lorraine replied. And she did, with complete clinical clarity. She understood exactly what was happening. She had seen the architecture of it before. In depositions, in complaints, in internal affairs files at cross or bench because local systems couldn't or wouldn't address them internally. The planted evidence. The claimed malfunction of recording equipment. The public humiliation designed to destabilize the target before they could organize a defense. The private space designed to complete what the public space had started. The offer resolution that would come later. Some form of quiet deal that made the problem disappear in exchange for the target's silence, compliance, and departure. She had read this playbook in 100 civil rights cases. She had never expected to be its subject, but since she intended to use the experience with the same precision she brought to everything else. Every word, every action, every procedural violation. Being noted, the cell phone privileges they restored for her single allowed call came 12 hours after medical requests she had submitted sat untouched through 3 complete guard rotations. The night nurse who finally examined her shoulder used the words minor discomfort while reaching for her clipboard, and Lorraine interrupted her with the quiet, unmovable certainty of someone who had been precise and careful witness to her own injury. I believe you can see the bruising along the deltoid and trapezius, she said, her voice gentle, factual. The discoloration is consistent with deep tissue trauma from forceful restraint applied at approximately 12:45 p.m. yesterday, with additional aggravation at 1:30 p.m. during transport. The delay in medical examination, approximately 30 hours, should probably be documented as well, for accuracy. The nurse paused. Her pen hovered. She was a professional, and professionals respond to precision, to the acknowledgement of what they can clearly see. She crossed out her first notation and began again, this time with clinical accuracy. Lorraine watched each word appear on the page and filed a timestamp. When AUSA Nain Price's voice came through the phone, it carried barely contained fury that Nain's professional training compressed into something that sounded like precision. The lab rushed their analysis of the bag. Nain said, "It came back positive, of course." "Who signed the chain of custody forms?" Lorraine asked immediately. "What?" "The evidence handling documentation. I need to know who touched that bag, when, where it was stored between the time of alleged discovery and the time it reached the lab, whether photographs were taken before it was moved, whether Officer Rohr handled it directly or whether Security Director Clean passed it to him, whether the exact floor coordinates were documented at discovery." A pause. Then understanding arrived in Nain's voice like a slow dawn. "You're mapping their procedural violations. Every shortcut breaks a rule," Lorraine said quietly. "Every rush step leaves a trace. They're trying to use the machinery of law enforcement as a weapon, but that machinery has more moving parts than they've accounted for. Pull those handling records. Compare every timestamp against the incident report. Check who had authorization to access the evidence room. Cross-reference their lab submission paperwork against the stated time of discovery." She was building the case from inside the cage, and the cage, as it turned out, had more windows than her captors had noticed. In the holding cell, she had found an unexpected ally. Ruthie Collins, silver-haired, soft-voiced, with eyes that had seen too much of what Lorraine was now experiencing firsthand, had shifted on the metal bench to make room the moment Lorraine was brought in. She'd seen them bring you in from the mall, Ruthie said, and then in whispered fragments over the following hour, she had described a pattern so consistent, so methodically repetitive, that Lorraine had begun to understand it wasn't a series of isolated incidents. It was a system, same officers, same mall, same script, mostly black shoppers. Always the same language, concealment, resistance, additional charges found during search. Always the same pressure to take a plea before the target could organize a defense. Ruthie's granddaughter had been caught in it the previous month. She'd lost her job before she could fight back. She'd taken the plea because she had 2 children at home and no money for bail and no time to wait for the wheels of justice to turn at their proper pace. That story settled into Lorraine like a stone into water, not with outrage. She was too disciplined for outrage, but with a cold, clarifying recognition of a pattern that demanded dismantling. She spent the next hour quietly teaching Ruthie how to document times, names, badge numbers, exact quotes, the sequence of events, the specific language used, the particular procedural irregularities that distinguish deliberate misconduct from honest error. She taught her how to transform memory into evidence, because in the absence of official documentation, memory, precisely organized and consistently maintained, was the closest thing available. Ruthie wrote everything down on a torn corner of a paper bag with a pencil stub she had somehow preserved through intake processing. Elijah Boone arrived at Briarwood Mall the next morning in jeans and a weathered leather jacket, moving through the early crowd of mall walkers and retail employees with the unhurried ease of a man who had spent decades learning how to be visible without being noticed. His trained eye traced the ceiling lines, mapping camera positions and calculating the gaps between their fields of view. He noted which angles overlapped, which corridors were blind, and which camera placements had been chosen to maximize the impression of surveillance, while minimizing what was actually captured. He paused at a directory near the mall's central hub, using its reflective surface to observe the cameras he couldn't openly study. That's when he saw Milo Garner at his electronics kiosk, arranging the same display of phone cases he had probably arranged 6 times already that morning, hands moving with the mechanical repetition of a person who needed to do something with their hands while their mind worked on something else entirely. Milo's eyes found Boone's reflection and held it for just a moment. Recognition, wariness, something else underneath, the specific tension of someone who had seen something they couldn't unsee and was trying to decide what to do about it. Boone moved to the kiosk with the browsing casualness of a potential customer. "Nice selection," he said quietly, picking up a phone case. Milo's hand steadied on the display. "I saw what they did to her," he said, barely above a whisper. "The judge. It wasn't right." "No," Boone said. "It wasn't. They already came for my footage. Security team this morning said it was protocol to collect all relevant surveillance as part of the loss prevention incident record. Did you give it to them?" "I had to." A pause. Then, bending to adjust a lower shelf, moving his lips as little as possible. "But I keep backups. My camera catches reflections in the storefront glass. It's like a mirror for this whole section of the corridor. It got everything." Boone reached into his jacket and slid a small external drive onto the counter with the casualness of someone paying for a purchase. "Copy everything from yesterday. All angles. Then store the original somewhere outside this building." He paused. "Ms. Clean is going to notice any unusual activity on your system." "I know," Milo said. His hands were steadier now. "I'll do it as inventory reconciliation. Nobody flags inventory work." As Boone walked away at the same unhurried pace he'd arrived with, his phone buzzed. Nane's text arrived in 2 flat sentences. "Mall claim system crash." All footage corrupted after routine update. Of course it was. Boone's rearview mirror caught the dark sedan exactly 3 cars behind him before he'd reached the second traffic light. Amateur surveillance, visible enough to function as a warning rather than actual tracking. They wanted him to know he was being watched. They wanted the knowledge of being watched to do the work of the actual watching. He drove home at normal speed, noting the sedan's patience, its consistency, the practiced 3-car distance it maintained through 4 turns and 1.5 miles of residential streets. His front porch light was gone when he pulled in. Not burned out. The socket was empty, the glass broken, pieces swept aside but not fully cleaned up. Someone had taken their time with it. In his front lawn, fresh tire tracks cut dark furrows through the evening dew, the kind of tracks that required a vehicle to have driven fully off the road and onto private property. A police cruiser idled at the corner, engine running, positioned with a clear sight line to his front walk. Boone pulled out his phone before he was fully out of the car. First, the cruiser's partial plate number, visible under the streetlight. Then the tire tracks, photographed from multiple angles with ruler scale context. Then the broken light socket. His movements were unhurried, methodical, the movements of someone who had documented scenes like this many times before and knew exactly what a court would need to verify them. The phone rang twice. "They're moving faster than we expected," he told Nain. "Are you safe?" "Fine, but they're not being subtle anymore." He described what he'd found as he continued his perimeter walk. The trespass notice in the crisp white envelope on his kitchen table, printed on Briarwood Mall letterhead, signed with the hurried pressure of someone following orders that made them uncomfortable. "They're trying to box me out formally, probably hoping the combination of the cruiser and the legal notice produces compliance without requiring any further action. They're panicking," Nain said, "which means we're closer than they want us to be." 3 towns over, in a coffee shop chosen specifically for its noise level and its distance from Pine Hollow County's operational radius, Nain sat across from Tessa Hargrove and watched a young woman try and decide whether her conscience was worth the risk it was going to cost her. Tessa was maybe 25, still wearing the name tag from her morning shift at the boutique, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. She had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't slept and was replaying the same memory on a continuous loop. "Miss Clean came to the stockroom before opening," Tessa said, her voice just above the ambient noise of the cafe. "She said we needed to prepare for a special loss prevention exercise, that we should watch for a specific customer, that when she gave the signal, we needed to report a missing item." "Did she specify which item?" Tessa reached into her bag and produced a folded stack of pages. Inventory reports, receipt logs, system-generated records with clean timestamps and sequential entry numbers. Nothing was missing. "I printed these before I left this morning. Everything balances. Every item, every transaction, every return. There was no theft. There was never any theft. The documents were irrefutable. System-generated data could not be retroactively altered without creating exactly the kind of audit trail Raj Patel's testimony would later expose." Nain looked at the pages with the focused attention of someone who had just been handed the structural foundation of an entire case. "I should have said something right then," Tessa whispered. "When I saw what they did to that woman in the hallway, when I saw her face." "You're saying something now," Nain said. "That's what matters." At that moment, Boone set his laptop on the table between them. The video clip played, an odd angle, a storefront glass reflection, but clear enough. It showed Lorraine walking calmly down the corridor. It showed both officers moving into position before anyone from any store had approached them, before any inventory concern had been raised, before any report had been filed. The timestamps were embedded in the file metadata. The sequence was unambiguous. They had been waiting for her. This had been planned before she walked through the mall's front doors. Tessa's sworn statement took 40 minutes to complete. Every detail was recorded with precision. Clean's exact words in the stockroom, the timing of the briefing relative to the mall's opening, the names of other employees who had been present for the instructions. When the last page was signed, something had shifted in the quality of the air in that corner booth. The case had ceased to be a single incident of misconduct and had become something with shape, depth, history, and pattern. Lorraine walked out of Pine Hollow County Jail on supervised bond that afternoon with her suit wrinkled, her shoulders still deeply sore, and her spine as straight as a plumb line. She shook Nain's hand and nodded at Boone and said 3 words, "Show me everything." In the private law office conference room, the whiteboard became a timeline. Her marker moved with judicial efficiency, the kind of efficient, precise motion that comes from years of organizing complex information under time pressure. Video timestamps, witness statements, security logs, evidence handling records, technical affidavits, She built the architecture of the case the way she had built every major ruling of her career, by finding the structure hidden inside the chaos, by identifying a pattern that connected the individual violations into a coherent whole. Here, she said, tapping a cluster of times on the left side of the board. Clean's briefing to the boutique staff happens at 9:15 a.m., 2 hours and 48 minutes before I enter the mall, before any possible theft, before any possible observation of any suspicious behavior. The briefing precedes the subject by nearly 3 hours. That's not loss prevention. That's premeditation. Her marker moved to the right. The officers initiate contact at 12:07 p.m. The first actual inventory check doesn't occur until 12:23 p.m., 16 minutes after the arrest. They detained me before any evidence of theft existed, because the detention was never about evidence of theft. Another cluster of times. Both body cameras deactivate at 12:11 p.m., not due to technical malfunction. Raj Patel's logs will show that both units were manually deactivated to the department's remote administration system at 12:11 and 34 seconds p.m. and 12:11 and 41 seconds p.m., respectively, 7 seconds apart. A malfunction doesn't produce sequential manual deactivations. She drew a circle around the center of the timeline and wrote 3 letters inside it. USV, PHC, United States versus Pine Hollow County, the federal corruption case involving the county's asset seizure program that she had been quietly assigned to hear the following month. The case that would examine, in detail, a scheme in which law enforcement partnerships with private entities like Briarwood Mall had been used to generate civil forfeiture revenue that bypassed standard oversight mechanisms entirely. The room was silent for a moment as the full geometry of it became visible to everyone present. They had not targeted her randomly. They had not targeted her because she was the nearest available subject for their routine operation. They had targeted her specifically, deliberately, with precise advanced knowledge of her judicial assignment, because a sitting federal judge with a corrupted public record could not credibly oversee the very trial designed to expose the system she had allegedly participated in. The mall arrest was not the crime. It was the cover for crime. It was character assassination deployed as a legal instrument, a preemptive strike against the one person most positioned to hold them accountable. They've been running this operation for years, Boone said quietly. Rohr and Voss are their front line. The mall partnership provides a venue and the cover. The civil forfeiture pipeline generates the revenue. But you, he looked at Lorraine, are the first federal judge they've ever targeted, which means they panicked. And panic makes people sloppy. They've already been sloppy, Lorraine said. Her voice remained perfectly level. Raj's logs document 11 separate deletion commands issued from Clean's credentials between 2:47 p.m. and 4:23 p.m. on the day of my arrest. 11. They weren't just deleting evidence of my arrest. They were deleting the broader access logs that would reveal the pattern of prior deletions. They created the very record trail that proves the habit. Nain spread the warrant applications across the table. Civil rights violations under color of law. Obstruction of justice. Conspiracy to interfere with federal proceedings. Evidence tampering. Elevated to federal criminal statute. We have enough. We have more than enough, Lorraine said. File everything tonight. The county's attorney arrived the next afternoon, wearing a particular expression of a man who has been sent to deliver an offer he knows will be refused and is hoping to be wrong. He placed a manila envelope on the table between them with a careful, deliberate movement of someone diffusing a device. Simple probation, he said. No jail time. A quiet resignation from the bench. To protect the dignity of the position. The charge is sealed upon completion. Everyone moves forward. Lorraine looked at the papers without touching them. She had spent 23 years on the federal bench watching people make this calculation. The calculation between what was right and what was safe, between what justice required and what convenience offered. She had watched defendants take deals that spared them worse consequences. She had watched prosecutors offer deals that served the efficiency of the system rather than its integrity. She understood the math of compromise. She simply did not accept it. No, she said. The word arrived without drama, without volume, without any of the emotional weight the attorney had probably expected. It was just a word, the most precise word available for what she intended to communicate. She turned to Nain. "We take everything." The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when Lorraine ascended them between Nain and Boone on the morning of a hearing. She wore a charcoal suit instead of judicial robes. Today she was a witness and a complainant. Today the elevated bench was above her rather than beneath her. She had prepared herself for the psychological architecture of that reversal with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. She was ready. Inside, officers Rohr and Voss moved through courthouse security with a particular swagger of men who have not yet understood that the ground has shifted beneath them. Their badges were prominent, their postures confident, their expressions carefully arranged into the professional neutrality of officers who have nothing to be concerned about. Behind them, Janice Clean arrived with 2 attorneys from a firm that had handled Pine Hollow County's institutional defense work for years. Her corporate smile was perfect and constant and gave nothing away. Judge Harold Martinez recused himself within the first 3 minutes of the hearing, citing prior professional relationships with county officials that he acknowledged created an unavoidable appearance of conflict. The case was immediately reassigned to Chief Judge Eleanor Avery, who had cleared her calendar to hear it and whose reputation, 30 years on the federal bench, constitutional precision, zero tolerance for governmental overreach, preceded her with the kind of specificity that made defense attorneys check their briefs twice before standing up. Nain laid out the evidence with the methodical precision of someone who had organized it and reorganized it until every piece fit into its proper load-bearing position. The IT access logs, blockchain verified, showing Clean's credentials initiating 11 deliberate deletions beginning 12 minutes after Lorraine was taken to the security office. Denise Harper's live stream footage, broadcast in real time, making retroactive tampering technically impossible, showing the initial confrontation before any store employee had reported anything, before any inventory concern had been raised. Milo Garner's kiosk reflection captures, which documented the physical force applied during the detention from an angle the officers hadn't known existed, and Raj Patel's technical affidavit, walking through the deletion sequence in terms precise enough for a jury with no IT background to follow and understand. Clean's attorney objected to the technical evidence. Nain pointed to the blockchain verification and the real-time broadcast metadata. Judge Avery overruled the objection, set the case for expedited trial in 2 weeks, approved the expanded obstruction warrants, and ordered the immediate preservation of all Pine Hollow County records, with severe sanctions attached to any further deletion or alteration. Rohr's swagger diminished visibly during the hearing. Voss sat very still in a way that communicated not calm, but the effort required to maintain the appearance of calm. Clean's attorneys wrote rapid, urgent notes on legal pads that they shielded from adjacent sight lines. The trial itself moved with the compressed, focused energy of proceedings where the evidence is extensive and unambiguous. Denise Harper testified to what she had seen and filmed. Milo Garner walked the jury through his kiosk camera's geometry and the angle of the corridor reflections. Raj Patel explained the deletion sequence with the patience of someone who had spent years translating technical complexity for non-technical audiences, and he was good at it, clear, specific, devoid of jargon, focused entirely on helping 12 ordinary people understand exactly what happened to exactly which files, at exactly which time, under exactly which credentials. When Lorraine took the stand, the courtroom achieved a silence so complete that the ventilation system became audible. She spoke with the same measured clarity she brought to every professional interaction, but directed now at the task of reconstruction, rebuilding, in precise and verifiable language, every moment of what had happened to her in Briarwood Mall and Pine Hollow County Jail. She described the force applied with clinical exactness. She quoted the words used with the accuracy of someone who had been committing language to memory since the moment it was spoken. When the defense attorney suggested she had expected special treatment because of her position, she corrected him quietly and without visible irritation. She had expected lawful treatment, which is what every citizen is entitled to expect, regardless of position. When he suggested she had been combative, she asked him to define combative, and when he couldn't produce a definition that fit the evidence, she provided one herself, and it did not describe anything she had done. Rohr's testimony collapsed in increments under the weight of synchronized evidence. The phone records contradicted his timeline. The body cam deactivation logs contradicted his malfunction story. The witness footage contradicted his account of her behavior during the arrest. Nain walked him through each contradiction with the methodical, unemotional precision of someone building a wall, one brick at a time, and watching the person trapped behind it understand, incrementally, that there was no door. The jury deliberated for less time than anyone on the defense team had hoped. When they filed back in, their faces carried the particular gravity of people who have spent hours with evidence that told a clear story and have made their peace with what the story required of them. Guilty on civil rights violations under color of law. Guilty on evidence tampering. Guilty on obstruction of justice. Guilty on conspiracy to violate civil rights. The gallery remained silent as Judge Avery ordered immediate remand to federal custody pending sentencing. The silence was an emptiness. It was a particular quality of air in a room where something important has just been decided, where the weight of justice has finally landed in the right place after traveling a very long distance to get there. The click of handcuffs echoed in the hushed courtroom as federal agents moved forward. Roar's face flushed dark red as the metal closed around his wrists. He had put those same cuffs on other people in public spaces for years, using them as instruments of humiliation and control. He understood now, in a way he had never bothered to consider before, what they felt like from the other side. Voss stared at the floor and kept staring at it as he was secured. Klein's protest died before they fully formed. Outside, Nain told reporters that today's verdict was a beginning rather than the end, that the U.S. Attorney's Office was filing parallel civil actions targeting Pine Hollow County's asset forfeiture pipeline, that the scope of the conspiracy extended well beyond these three defendants, and that the investigation would continue until every thread had been followed to its conclusion. Lorraine stood beside Boone and said nothing. The verdict said everything that needed to be said. In the weeks that followed, the consent decree arrived with the weight of federal authority behind it. New body cam protocols. Mandatory continuous operation during all civilian interactions. Severe penalties for deactivation. An independent oversight board with real investigative power and no institutional loyalties to the department it supervised. The Mall Security Partnership Program was dismantled entirely. Asset forfeiture policies were rewritten with actual probable cause requirements and mandatory judicial review. Former detainees came forward. Dozens of them. People who had been processed through the same pipeline. Same officers, same script, same pressure to accept plea deals before they could organize a defense. Each case, examined under federal oversight, added detail and dimension to the pattern that had always been there, waiting for someone with the position and the will and the documentation to name it publicly and force accountability. Raj Patel was reinstated with back pay. Milo Garner received a commendation that he kept on the wall of his kiosk, next to a small framed note from Lorraine thanking him for his courage. Denise Harper's live stream footage was incorporated into Police Academy civil rights training, used specifically to demonstrate what proper citizen documentation looks like and why it matters. Tessa Hargrove returned from protective custody to testify in the civil proceedings, and her testimony, along with the inventory records she had printed and saved, became the foundation of conspiracy charges against Klein. Ruthie Collins received a call from Lorraine's office 3 months after the verdict. Her granddaughter's case was being reviewed. The plea agreement was being examined for coercion. There was no promise of outcome. Lorraine was too precise a lawyer to make promises about cases she hadn't fully reviewed, but there was a commitment to look carefully and without prejudice at what had actually happened. For Ruthie, that was enough. On a bright morning weeks after the verdict was entered into the federal record, Lorraine descended the courthouse steps in the sunlight that fell warm and direct on her face and shoulders. The shoulders still carried a faint reminder of what happened. Not pain exactly, but a residual awareness, a sensitivity where the bruising had been. She had stopped thinking of it as damage. She had begun to think of it as information. She had demonstrated, through everything that followed from a Tuesday afternoon in a mall corridor, that justice does not require drama. It does not require volume or fury or righteous performance. It requires documentation. It requires precision. It requires a particular kind of courage that is not loud, the courage to keep your head up and your mind working in a moment specifically designed to make both impossible. The system had tried to break her through public humiliation, through manufactured evidence, through isolation and pressure, and the weight of institutional authority deployed without conscience. Instead, she had used every element of that attempt, every violation, every procedural shortcut, every moment of calculated cruelty, as a brick in a case that dismantled it, because corruption does not understand that its tools are double-edged. It does not understand that the machinery of law enforcement, turned against the innocent, leaves records. That records, preserve and organize and place before the right eyes, become evidence. That evidence, presented with precision in the right venue, becomes accountability. And that accountability, applied consistently and without compromise, becomes change. True authority does not come from force. It never has. It comes from the unwavering, patient, methodical insistence on justice, even when you're the one in the handcuffs, especially then.